Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always and everywhere acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. For these rest of the Sundays of Epiphany, we're hearing from the gospel readings are from the Sermon on the Mount, which is the heart of Jesus' teachings in the Gospel of Matthew. Last week, if you were here, we heard the readings from the first part of the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus is talking about what it is to be blessed. The word Makarios, which Jesus used in talking about who is blessed, is a word that actually means happy. We think of it as holiness and all of that, but it's actually a word that in its context means to be happy. The people who are happy, Jesus says, are an unusual group of people. They're not necessarily the ones we think of as being happy, but Jesus says they are. They are the ones who are poor in spirit, the ones who are meek, the ones who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the ones who are persecuted, the ones who mourn, the ones who are merciful. And what Jesus is saying is that those experiences that we all have, I think they're the ones that keep us open to the spirit of compassion. They're the ones, those experiences that may be grinding and hard for us, but they grind away the rough edges too, so that we can truly experience an openness to the Spirit of God. In this section from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus begins to enter what we call his moral exhortations. The first part is not about morality, it's just a given. These people are the happy ones. But in this section of the Sermon on the Mount and the ones that follow, Jesus is exhorting the people to be righteous. Now, in some ways, righteousness is totally derived in the Christian community from what it meant to be righteous in the Jewish community. Jesus, in presenting his understanding of what it means to be righteous, is drawing on that vein, that large river of wisdom and exhortation from the Hebrew prophets and from the commands. In this section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, above all, is identifying himself as a good Jew. Because for a good Jew, righteousness was the most important quality of a human being. To be righteous was to demonstrate that you loved God and that you honored his creation. And so Jesus, in this particular section of the Sermon on the Mount, is talking about how we go from being ourselves and who we are and the person we've created to becoming the righteousness of God. So he's identifying himself, first of all, as a good Jew. But then, as we'll see as the sermon progresses, he turns a lot of the teachings of Judaism around and he expands them and he concentrates not so much on our actions but also on our words, on our thoughts. And so Jesus is presenting a holistic way of thinking about righteousness. And so in this particular passage, he gives us two images of what it means to be a righteous person. The first is the image of salt. A righteous person is like salt. Now, salt it's something that we need in our bodies, and we don't need too much of it. We don't need to order double orders of fries every day. But we all need a little bit of salt. In addition, salt is used to preserve. It's used to restore. It's such an important mineral in the history of the world that wars have been fought over salt. And it can lose its flavor. There was a kind of salt that was used in Jesus' day and time that was derived from the Dead Sea. I don't know if you're interested in this, but it's interesting to me. And if you left it out too long, it would, in fact, lose its flavor. So, first of all, Jesus is saying that the righteous person is one that adds flavor, that is necessary for the life of the world. Secondly, he's saying that light, the righteous person is a person of light, a person who shines in their own context, a person who is able to provide the light by which truth is experienced, a person who can guide us through the darkness. And he's saying, be someone of light. Be not only a person of light, but join with others to be a city on the hill full of light. So for Jesus, to be a righteous person is to add something essential to the world around us. It's a high calling, this image of what it means for Jesus when Jesus says that we are to be righteous. And, you know, we can think of being salt and being light, I think, in ways that guide us in our everyday lives. You know, when we're in a situation and we think, well, what's the right thing to do? Now we can say to ourselves, well, how might I shine light on this situation? Or how might I give salt to this situation so that it rises, so it's full of the meaning of righteousness? Now, for a Jew in Jesus' day, a good devout Jew, there were 613 commandments in the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And there were also 10 commandments, the 10 commandments that we all learn and know, live by. So for a Jew of Jesus' day, to be righteous meant to keep all of these commandments. And what he's doing in this passage is not taking away the importance of living by commandments, but he's drawing people to see that there's a spirit within and beyond those commandments too. A spirit that maybe, you know, gives us guidance and also gives us a goal for how to be and how to become in the world around us. He's taking us away in many ways from the many legalisms of Judaism without taking away the import of those commandments. He's saying that there's a way to live in the world and be righteous without having to think so legalistically about what is right all the time. Now, if you were a good, devout Jew in the time of Jesus, as Paul was, this was liberating news to him. Because Paul was someone, and I think you can see it in many of his letters, who had almost an obsessive need to be right about things. And he talks about that in his epistles, that he was really a driven human being. And he felt that to be righteous, he had to keep all of those commandments perfectly, or at least keep them in mind all the time. And for Paul, that was a problem because it made him feel very guilty all the time because he wasn't keeping them perfectly. He was obsessed with this idea of being righteous as following the law totally and perfectly. And so he talks in his own epistles about how guilt-ridden and how anxious he was about being righteous. Because for Paul, it was this whole journey of obeying command after command after command. And he was exhausted. He blamed himself and criticized himself for not being perfect until he had his conversion experience on the road to Damascus. That conversion experience Paul talks about 3 times, and it's also talked about in the book of Acts. And what happened to Paul was that instead of trying so hard to fulfill all of these commandments, he felt as though he was given a Spirit of God in himself, a wisdom, as he talks about in 1 Corinthians, a spirit to know God, a spirit that guided him, that led him out into the world to do the wisdom and the good works of God. So he's not operating from his head so much anymore after his conversion. He's operating instead out of his heart. And that's important for us as Christians to realize, that we're still called to be righteous, but we're not called to slavishly obey all of the commands all of the time. St. Augustine said that, we should love God and do as we will. And lots has been written about that, but his idea is that if we really love God, and if we know the Spirit of God in our hearts, we'll be open to doing works of justice, works of mercy. And we will become even more righteous than those who feel that moral perfection is the goal of righteousness. Spirituality is therefore key to what it means to be righteous in the Christian community. Spirituality is a way of our becoming united with the love of God. That's all it is. Spirituality is what takes us from our individuality and connects us to the Spirit of God and to the Spirit of God in one another. And for Paul, and I think for most Christians throughout the world, the pinnacle, the height of what it means to be righteous is to be a loving person, to dedicate yourself to however and wherever you can live out the spirit of love. That's what Christians have to form and shape themselves around all the time. That knowledge, that depth, that the Spirit is working within us all the time. And we need to be open to it. I mean, taking time every day to spend in meditation or prayer. For many of us, it's nature. It's looking at that beautiful sunset in the sky and the gold and the pink and the orange colors, especially in the winter. I mean, sunsets are incredible. And thinking of those wonders of nature as God's beauty given to us, to lift us up, to give us a sense of awe and wonder. And so the Christian way is to take all of the Spirit that we find through prayer and meditation, through the Eucharist, through being together in community, to take all of that and use it to develop our love of God and our love of other human beings. Jesus will summarize the 613 commandments and the 10 commandments later on when he says, what is required? To love the Lord your God with your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That's how we enter the whole way, the journey of being righteous. It's not through slavishly having all these commands that we have to obey all the time, feeling like we're failures if we're not perfect, but it's fueling ourselves, giving us the energy, the spirit, the wisdom to really be filled with God's light. So, the Sermon on the Mount takes us through a whole series of teachings about righteousness. Not so that we blame ourselves when we're not righteous, but so we're filled with the Spirit in order to become God's light and God's salt in the world around us. Not worried so much about pleasing God, but being the light in the world, the salt in the world that does please God through our simple actions. That's what Jesus is saying in this gospel. We may not be like Paul in having tremendous experiences of mysticism, but we can be ordinary, everyday mystics. We can walk through the world noticing little things and big things that speak to us of the love of God, speak to us of the beauty of creation, speak to us of all that we value in life. We can walk through the world trying to have these experiences of openness to the Spirit. And as we do, we store that up. We become more and more people of salt and of light, fulfilling the commandment of Jesus to be righteous. And that is the path of the Christian faith. In the name of God, our Creator and Redeemer and Sustainer. Amen.